Merhaba, panelimize hoş geldiniz.
Hello, welcome to our panel. We will be talking about good governance practices for sustainable cities. We have panelists with us and we're going to discuss this topic with them. We have 4 panelists, 4 speakers. We will have 3 rounds in this panel and then we will have a question and answer session. I would like to introduce the panelists, starting with myself. I am Erkin Erimez. I am a graduate of Boğaziçi University. I started as a TA at Boğaziçi University. Then I joined Borusan Holding. And I have experience in the areas of sustainability and good governance. I became a manager. And ever since 2003, I have been functioning as a consultant. And I joined ARGE consultancy, and I'm a board member as well. I am a board member of UN Global Compact Turkey as well. And I'm a lecturer at university. Ferhat Emil is right to my left. He graduated from the from the Politics Department of Politics of Middle Eastern Technical University in Ankara. And he was a visiting fellow and also a graduate student at Northwestern University. He worked at IMF and World Bank in various positions. In 2003, he left the Ministry of Treasury and functioned as an independent consultant, and he is a regular contributor to Koç University's monthly on finances and economics. He has experience in the area of good governance with local administrations. Ladies and gentlemen, the moderator is reading out the CVs of the panelists. Unfortunately, we do not have the list in front of us, so we will stop interpretation here and start interpreting again once the panel starts.
Arda'da el kitapları hazırladı. Kendisi 1996'dan bugüne kadar Bilkent Üniversitesi Ekonomi Bölümünde ders vermekte. Ayrıca 96-2014 yılları arasında Ankara Üniversitesi Siyasal Bilgiler Fakültesi Finansman ve Ekonomi Bölümünde dersler verdi. Aynı zamanda kendisi Yerel Yönetimlerin Finansmanı adlı kitabında yazarlarından biri. Hemen onun yanında Arda Batu var. Kendisi TÜRKONFED'den katılıyor. TÜRKONFED'in genel sekreteri. Arda da 2001 yılında...
To the left is Arda Batu. Arda Batu graduated from the Department of International Relations at Boğaziçi University.
Enstitüsü'nden yüksek lisans derecesini aldı.
He graduated from the master's program of public administration at Marmara University, and he's currently a PhD student, and he joined as a project manager at a consultancy company and switched over to London and worked in the areas of risk and political consultancy. Later it was Stratejikon.
Bunun dışında kendisi Federal Mogul Piston, İzmit Piston AŞ'de Bağımsız Yönetim Kurulu üyesi, EDAM Yönetim Kurulu üyesi, Turkish Policy Quarterly'nin yazı kurulu üyesi, Ayrıca Birleşmiş Milletler, Avrupa Birliği, NATO gibi kurumlar adına, artı ARGE gibi kurumlar adına projeler tasarlayıp da yönetmiş bir arkadaşımız. Ertuğrul Onur şu anda TEİD'in başkanı. Ertuğrul da İstanbul Üniversitesi Hukuk Fakültesi.
Ertuğrul studied law at Istanbul University, registered at Istanbul Bar, and then he continued to work in BP as a legal consultant, and he became the working representative, and he's actually a member of the European Working Representatives Assembly. He joined Pfizer. Following that, he became a VP in charge of legal. He established the legal department, and he also established the ethics and compliance department. Left Pfizer, joined Coca-Cola. He's still working there. And in 2013, in ethics and compliance, he established a department between 2013 and 16. He worked as the ethics and compliance director, continued to be the president of the same committee. And, well, now he's the president of the current president. In terms of ethics and compliance, he's one of the trainers of the certificate program. Last but not least, we have İnan İzci from Argüden Governance Academy. İnan studied in London for BA in Social Policies. Following his BA in the same university, he finished his master's degree in European Union and public policy, and now he's about to finish his PhD. And for 4 years, he worked on advocacy of citizen rights in United Kingdom, and then he came to Turkey in the provincial administration. He worked as the EU relations coordinator, and he worked as a consultant of sustainability, and then he joined Argüden Governance Academy. He has been working since then, and the main objective is to make sure that in Turkey and in the world, to improve the phenomena of governance in the companies. In 2018, they published the scorecard of municipalities, including 37 municipalities, and he's one of the authors. So sustainability is one of the themes of today, which is actually a very wide area, and that covers every dimension of our lives. However, for an effective functioning of the sustainability is only through governance. And you know, one of the SDGs, the 11th SDG, is on the sustainable cities. And we should not simply think of that in isolation. The remaining 16 objectives are directly related with this. Where if you fail to offer hygiene in water, which is the 6th objective, or if you can't have gender equality, which is the 5th objective, or if you can't offer proper health services, which is the 3rd one, and every party has a responsibility, we can't talk about a sustainable city. The 16th and 17th objectives directly have to do with the approach of governance. 16th is on peace and being just, fighting against corruption. The 16th objective is interinstitutional partnership. And in 2015, this became a huge discussion, and everyone all of a sudden started to think and discuss that even though these things obviously belong to the domain of the governments or states, they accept that they sometimes fail to do that, and they have to do it with the inclusion of the other parties. So actually, that has the participation of the other parties and stakeholders. Ferhat Bey, I would like to get started with you. Well, within the scope of the Sustainable Cities Framework, what is the benefit or opportunity of the good governance? What happens if we don't do our part there? Well, thank you very much, Erkin. Good morning, everyone. Well, I was prepared for this question. You had provided the questions to us, so I'm just going to get help from my notes. Well, ladies and gentlemen, sustainable cities or sustainability, the notion of sustainability, has become a buzzword. It's sort of a lip service, which means they started to lose their essential meaning. You know, the United Nations have their global objectives, SDGs. The 11th, as Erkin mentioned, directly has to do with the sustainable cities. But when we say sustainable cities, we essentially mean that in the long term, a city has to attain a number of properties so that the city is self-sustaining and it could repeat itself and it could simply support itself. And from the governance perspective, and as you are familiar, it has been discovered in the aftermath of 90s, and the Turkish expression is not my favorite, to tell you the truth, which is yönetişim. It has something to do with the management style. If you have a poor management style, poor governance, or if it's good, then it's called good governance. However, it has become a tradition that we stick with the term yönetişim because there is this participatory aspect which has to do with the communication. There is a plethora of definitions. So in a way to respond to your question, what we essentially and very simply understand from governance, I will do my best to answer, and in the next round of questions, these things which we assume have to do with governance or good governance, and with which we are more or less familiar. I'm going to at least give you the gist of it. What we mean by the good governance. What does it mean to have a good governance? So actually, it's very significant that stakeholders or citizens, particularly citizens from every walk of life, participate into the decision-making mechanisms. So it's obvious, but transparency is another important feature. I'm going to come to that in a minute, why that is important. Equality in some of the literature, men and women, without any discrimination, that has to do with the good governance, because at least that's something the public has to deal with. Ethical and ethical behavior, ethics and integrity, which have to do with the transparency. Another thing which we have to emphasize a little more is accountability as well as the transparency. So as a matter of fact, these are sort of things which give relief to the people, and we have to simply put a content into the words. And good governance have to have the objective of attaining sustainability. And we have to have a medium to long-term approach. So good governance is put into implementation so that the cities are sustainable from the perspective of the local administration. It's about the sustainability, making plans, allocation of resources, and there's a direct correlation with that. However, making the plans and allocation of resources, particularly from the things which I have listed, have to do so much with the transparency and accountability. So from that perspective, governance, or good governance to a certain extent, in three aspects, it is showing itself more in the scope of sustainable cities. The other ones are actually going to be the cherry on top, so to say, once these three are in place. And they will be easier to follow. Sustainability of cities has to be focused on and placed on this triangulation vis-a-vis the context of good governance. And as well as those, human rights, respecting human rights, sensitivity against social affairs. So many things could be placed upon the essentials. But so many things to discuss because we have the SDGs of the United Nations, and we have to put everything all together and coupled with the good governance so that we will live happily ever after is not actually rather easy to implement in practice, particularly in the less developed countries such as Turkey. World Bank or the other financial institution or international institutions are always emphasizing this concept of governance, which unfortunately takes place on every level. What is this? Particularly in recent years in the United States of America, Marlene Greenwood from Harvard is a professor who is sort of leading the way in this respect. It's not, well, I'm going to say it, good enough governance instead of good governance. That's what he offered. So, as much as we could do, good enough governance. So that's actually the attitude we have today, because almost no country, including Turkey, can simply develop governance in a fully fledged fashion. There are some shortcomings at all times. And so in a response to your question, I could say that it has to be placed upon triangulation, that good governance is important for sustainable cities, transparency, but I'm going to come to that, financial transparency, accountability, both legal and citizenship in terms of legal matters and citizenship, and medium-term approach from the perspective of municipalities is sort of the prerequisite of the sustainable development. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Now, actually, you have a point. When we talk about governance, we have to create a trust mechanism. As Professor Ferhat said, a fully fledged extensive participation into the decision-making mechanisms, and then that decision-making process is shared with the stakeholders in a transparent manner. And if a decision has been taken, the citizens should be informed why that particular decision has been taken. So if you receive a suggestion or recommendation, if you can't implement it immediately, you have to explain why you can't do that. Another critical aspect is the accountability part. So you have to take your decisions in an accountable fashion, because every decision you take is going to have repercussions on different groups of stakeholders. While doing so, you have to do the math. Another critical point is that you should not have a short-term view, because some things you do in the short term might simply prevent the value which would be created in the long term. And the most important thing is, as we heard, transparency is of great significance. I trust a transparent structure, whereas if it's not, I would not trust it. So from this perspective, actually we just discussed it. Cooperation for sustainable cities is very important, and local and central governments, citizens and NGOs. So these relationships should be structured actually properly. And we have to also consider another thing. Specialty is another critical matter. Citizens might have a number of expectations, but they might not have the specialty. They might have demands, and their expertise might not cover those at all times. So the specialty, expertise of the local administration, or if not, the expertise of the NGOs are going to cover that. That's why objective 17 is very important. Arda, now I would like to give the floor to you. So, from your own perspective, as TÜRKONFED, you have been able to disseminate your structure to the whole Anatolia, mainly comprised of small to medium enterprises. So, once you are in Anatolia, do you think that geography has that sustainability and sustainable development notion? Do you create an awareness? No and yes. So there is no awareness in Anatolia, there is no consciousness here, let alone Anatolia, there is none in Turkey nor in the world. And the professor used a great word, it has become a buzzword. There is a great logo, 17 chapters, 169 sub objectives, pamphlets, very fancy pamphlets have been published. And it's a rather new notion. Creating awareness is so important, coupled with governance, smart cities, with the whole dimension of development. 17 and 169 sub-objectives are very ambitious as a huge endeavor. And as an institution, we noticed this 3 years ago. We first became self-aware and we checked the structure of the major companies. And we looked at the fancy reports. And then we looked at the small to medium scale companies in Anatolia who happen to be our stakeholders. And then we saw that there's a very superficial understanding and awareness. And in 21st century, to have the competitive edge, I would like to emphasize this particularly, to have a competitive edge, this awareness needs to be increased. As an NGO of business community, this is what we became aware of. We became aware of and we self-trained under those 17 headings, what we could do, and within the scope of our objectives and targets, what we could do, and in order to align our activities vis-a-vis the SDGs, how we could categorize, compile, and revise them. And for the last 2 to 3 years, we have been actively involved in such efforts. Is that sufficient? Of course not. But I think that was actually a good enough beginning. And in terms of the sustainable development goals, we have 26 development zones and 207 member institutions, enterprises. We are now able to offer more productive help. We are talking about cities, we are talking about good governance. The definition by the professor was great. But, still that definition based on that triangulation is still valid, and that's what we accept in whatever we do. And for Turkey, and also valid for the world. This is my main message to you, my main take-home message. Even though you check the neighbor cities, Malatya, Kayseri, every one of those cities has different dynamics, different production capacities, and the development models have to be based on those. Well, of course, it has to be in line with the essential principles, but specific and unique to every city, and making use of the local know-how and expertise. We have to be in close contact with the center, as you said, that's very important. So that we have to keep that close contact between the local and the center. They have to be in great communication, and only then we are able to designate strategies. So the strategy won't work as follows. Well, the General Directorate of Strategy or the institutions in Ankara are going to designate a strategy and it's going to be given to the local. No, it doesn't work that way. It's not efficient. You have to make use of the local know-how, combine it with the central expertise, and then you will be able to make use of that. And we have been working on that with the development agencies and with the local stakeholders, which were now announced by the former Ministry of the Development. Now it has become Economy Minister, with the governor's offices, with the Union of Chambers and Union of Trades, and the civil initiatives, the NGOs of the business committees, their influencers, as we call them. So the executive boards or the CEOs of the boards of those companies, they have a great know-how, and we would like to make use of that. We can't afford to simply marginalize and put that on one side, claiming that is not useful. We have to make use of it in cooperation with the center. Only then we will be able to reach the right strategy. Thank you so much. Well, I think the point by Arda is very important. Not only NGOs of the business community, but the citizens should be also informed about some aspects. Particularly, there are some municipal strategy report drafting processes. If the population in a given district is more than 50,000, they have to provide such strategical reports and plans. It's like a guide, because in the upcoming 5 years, activities in those reports have to be allocated, a budget. Well, participation is of utmost importance. However, there is not always the same level of awareness. Climate change, take that as an example. It's a serious problem. And in the last 10 years, there has been great level of precipitation in the cities. Maybe the annual quantities are the same. However, the frequency and the precipitation volume which has been received has increased greatly, which points to an infrastructure problem. If we don't tackle that, there is flooding problem. Citizens might not always say that, but the municipalities have to simply talk about that and explain to the citizens that there has to be a certain allocated budget or resources for that, because after all we have finite resources. Or let me give you another example. In the cities, due to global warming, because of the changes in the precipitation regime, there might be shortage of water resources because of the water scarcity, and the citizens in general might not be always aware of that. And sometimes it's not always only up to the local administration. They have to tackle this in line in cooperation with the central government. You know, the biggest water consumer is agricultural industry. You have to tackle that so that you won't have water scarcity in the cities. And you can only do this with an institution like, they say, the water hydraulic works. We had something similar in Istanbul before. Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality and State Hydraulic Works worked together from Milan and another creek. They brought water to Istanbul from another city in the vicinity of Istanbul. So that's an example. You have to inform the citizens and you have to choose your stakeholders. For example, an institution in Istanbul, a company based on water, they have to be informed about that and they have to be warned about that, because after all it is going to affect both the livelihood of the people, of the community, as well as the livelihood of that company. So now coming to the ethics part, Ertuğrul. Ethics actually is one of the sine qua non of the sustainability notion, as Professor indicated. So as your Association of Ethics and Reputation, what do you do? How do you work in that respect? We would be great.
Thank you very much. I apologize for my voice. Well, the speaker needs to speak into a microphone, please, closer to the microphone. We cannot hear him, not because of his sore throat, but because he's away from the mic. Could you warn him, please? We cannot hear the speaker properly. He's away from the microphone. Can you please warn the speaker he's away from the microphone? We cannot hear him properly. There are other microphones that are on. They need to be switched off, and he needs to speak into the mic without turning away his head.
Olabilirsiniz. Çok müthiş işler başarmış olabilirsiniz. Devletlerden lisanslarınızı, ruhsatlarınızı almış olabilirsiniz. Ama sizlerin iç ve dış paydaşları vardır. Hadi iç size özgü kalsın ki o da bizim faaliyet konumuzuna giriyor. Ama dış paydaşların gözünde sizin faaliyetlerinize sağlıklı devam edebilmeniz için bir onay alması, bir kalplerinde onay alması gerekir. Bir onay alması gerekir. Biz buna işte
Well, it needs to get approval. So this is social licensing. This is what we call social licensing. If a company has a social license, then we can talk about a sustainable existence of this company. So if not, they will exist, but not too long. And the same holds true for public institutions as well. So we as an association try to preserve ethics and try to come up with programs that take into consideration ethical values, and we try to answer all the ethical norms and regulations and principles. We have roughly 140 corporate members, roughly 30 individual members, and we have a over of 15% of the overall GDP in our country. We are party to the United Nations Sustainable Development goals. And GCM as well, and everyone learns from one another. We share knowledge, we share values, and we are ready to share everything with the public as well for the past decade. So what do we do and what do we want? I need to quote Gandhi's words. There are material resources, financial, human, climate resources in the world. All of these are abundant to ensure the existence of humankind, but there are no resources to combat greed in the world. So good governance, sustainability, these are sine qua nons, these are a must. We need to grasp the importance of these and what they mean, and need to be advocates for that. We work together with the public sector as well as the private sector, and we share everything we know. We do share, and we value the exchange of knowledge very much for the benefit of the entire society. That's what we believe. Thank you. Ertuğrul, thank you very much. So the topic of social licensing is very important. Let me give you an example. Coca-Cola in India, around the 2000s, invested in 3 factories. 3 factories were found in agricultural areas, in agricultural regions. After these plants went into operation, Coca-Cola wanted to invest more because there was water scarcity, and the agricultural workers and farmers in those regions, because of water scarcity, came together. They organized themselves, and in the end were successful in convincing the governments, the local governments, to have those 3 Coca-Cola plants shut down because they were using up too much of the drinkable water resources that the people there could not benefit from. So that is very important, what Ertuğrul talked about when he mentioned social licensing. And there are many, many more examples in the world. İnan, let us continue with yourself. You have experienced firsthand Istanbul's good governance practices. What does comprehensive good governance mean? Thank you. Thank you very much for your memory as well, because you have read out our CVs without even taking one look at a text. So, what's our mission? Good governance, the fact of good governance, despite different political views, unites you. In what sense? There is one microphone on again. I'm very sorry, but it interferes constantly. There are more than 2 microphones on.
Bir iklimi, bir ilişkilenme biçimi. Ferhat hocamın bahsetmiş olduğum gibi yönetim tarzını işaret ediyor ama
So what good governance provides us with is security, an environment of security, quality of life, development, sustainability in our country is only possible if good governance practices are functioning as a multiplier. This is what we based our foundation on. And we try to bring together non-governmental institutions and organizations with the public and also the private sector. So what are we trying to do? According to the data from the year 2018, roughly 55% of the world population lives in urban areas, and until 2015 this will increase further to 68%. And this is considered to be a direct indicator of development. Urban areas, urban spaces are acting as catalysts of development in that sense. There are, of course, disadvantageous situations that led to urbanization, and urbanization is also a hub and a welcoming hub to newcomers that are looking for employment traditionally, and it's ongoing. So if you have vulnerable, so-called vulnerable, economically maybe depressed groups, people that have difficulties of accessing certain utilities and services, poor groups, you need to act inclusive. You need to adopt an inclusive and comprehensive stance so that everyone can benefit. Also, these groups can benefit from the resources that you have available to allocate. And you have to take a look at yourself and decide, are your policies and procedures and rules that you put forth indicative of that? Let me talk about Istanbul. Istanbul is a production and also consumption site. There are millions of people that are not employable. Because, for example, of women that need to take care of children or the elderly, disabled people that are not employable, or people that are not able to work because they are in need of care. So we have provincial municipalities, we have the greater municipality of Istanbul, we have social services, we have social aid institutions and charities and so on and so forth. Are they using or are they conducting studies based on solid data? That's the first question. Second of all, how are we supposed to come up with the best solutions? This is where good practices and good governance comes in. We need to act together with shareholders, including the academia, the non-governmental organizations, so that our limited resources can be allocated in the best way possible to the benefit of all. So let's go one step further. The idea of integration, integrated thinking or holistic approaches. Without strengthening the economic environment, you cannot create employment opportunities. And without employment opportunities, quality of life is lower. Because if you index public spending to the public funds, this may become problematic. Let me give you an example. A woman divorced from her husband with a child depends on a monthly allowance. And the child goes to kindergarten, and the kindergarten is of course not free of charge. So with a limited amount of money, what is she supposed to do? Pay for kindergarten, pay for her rent, or buy food for her family? If your provincial municipality and your greater municipality needs to build kindergartens in those areas where these women, for example, live. And in the end, enable these women, and not only women, but these vulnerable groups in general, to be able to adopt an employment. All of the concepts, they all sound wonderful and fine. They are put forth by the UN and other institutions, but they are nothing new. Solidarity and similar concepts, they are not new to us. Traditionally, we've been involved in solidarity actions because we have been taking care of the elderly and the children and so on and so forth. All of the municipalities, provincial municipalities in Istanbul have a social political agenda. But what about implementation? On paper, everything looks fine, but how much of it is being implemented? Only partially. Without ensuring a full implementation of all these social political principles and procedures and rules and what have you, we won't develop. So what we said to the municipalities was the following. Please do a thorough site analysis, a field analysis before putting forth social political agenda items, and adopt a holistic stance is what we said. So there is a huge difference between there is a commonality between the services that employment agencies provide and employment politics have to provide. So it is up to us to unite all these principles and cater to the needs of the public. So if only we knew how much people were employed at the end of a year, for example, then we could, in the end, establish sustainable cities. Well, I'm taking up a lot of time here maybe, but I believe this is very important to say. Good governance, SDG 16 and 17. Are two fundamental criteria or goals that also open the way for all the other SDGs. And in light of these two criteria, we need to render cities more important. And in order for us to be able to implement all the policies that we've been talking about, I believe neighborhoods are very important. If we mobilize the citizens, a lot of things will take care of themselves in a way. I believe that as much as possible we should implement sustainability in our own households and in our own neighborhoods. It all starts with the citizen itself. Thank you, Inan. You know, in order for a secure life, we need to reduce inequalities in a city. That's a given. Poverty, hunger, educational deficiencies, and so on and so forth, they all bear risks in terms of security for a city. Without ensuring all those, you are not able to render a city sustainable. And if we do an impact analysis, which I think is very important, we need to look at the entire process in the short and also in the long term. For example, in the short term, we may provide employment for a teacher, for example, and ensure education for the children. But what are the impacts, or what is the impact in the long term, for example? Likewise, the GDP of the countries, they increase with women's employment. This is a given. This is worldwide the same thing. So female employment is very, very important. These issues are very, very critical. Let me come back to you, Mr. Ferhat. Whatever we've talked about up until now is very important, but what requires further improvement so that we can render our cities more sustainable or sustainable? Thank you. Well, my fellow panelists have answered this question in part, but with your permission, I would like to make a couple of additions, taking up from where they left off, coming back to the three main points I was talking about in my initial speech. So transparency, sustainability, and medium-term perspective. These are very important, but what about the content of these three concepts? Let us look at that in a concrete fashion. It may open up a good governance and sustainability pathway to our cities, because transparency, sustainability, we talk about them constantly, and it bears the risk into the structural reform discussions that were eternally ongoing in this country. So transparency and sustainability, yes, sine qua non, that's what everyone says, but we need to provide content. We need to fill up these concepts. We need to fill them with content, as we like to say in Turkish. I try to stick to my allocated time as well. I do have little time, I'm aware of that. So financial governance is, I think, very important. So in order to ensure all of the things we've talked about, you need to have financial funds, and you need to allocate these funds in the proper fashion. My fellow panelists rightfully pointed out that this is all an issue of security, because sustainability, transparency, and everything else provides an environment of security. How are we supposed to ensure that? Transparency, I believe, is at the very bottom, at the foundation of this. So whatever issue we render transparent, we will ensure the security and also the trust of the citizen into the local administration. Of course, to what extent the citizens will be interested in these issues that we've been discussing so far is another issue in itself, but nevertheless, transparency is important. I've been part of 3 local administration projects within the scope of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals efforts, and they all included calls to the citizens. But when we make a call to municipalities to publish their expenditures and also their income and so on and so forth, and to which areas and to which activities they allocate their money to, I always received a negative response. So transparency in municipalities is not necessarily a given, not even today, albeit we've been discussing these issues for quite some time now. And the constant answer, or the standard answer we've been given by municipalities, is that they do not have any money to disclose at all. So this is of course nonsense, I believe. So I'll leave it at that. The second issue is the tender issue. Which tender went to whom, in what fashion, under which conditions? Because the most corruptive activities and most of corruption takes place in the tender processes. Exceptions are very well possible here as well, of course. Apart from that, another issue is reconstruction and zoning. Gentrification decisions with gentrification shall not be inexplicably or ununderstandably announced on blackboards. They shall be accessible content-wise to the public. Who is in charge of parking spots, for example, in a city? Who takes care of gardens? Who takes care of other efforts, other utility services in the city? They all need to be transparently disclosed. What about PPPs, public-private partnerships or projects? There is an ongoing effort based on certain pieces of legislation dating back many years ago, but concretely we don't see them. We have hundreds of build, operate and transfer projects, BOTs, but the content of them is not really disclosed to the public. We need to disclose what's on the agenda of city councils, for example, as well. And another issue is the issue of priority. Public servants, civil servants need to abide by codes of conduct and codes of ethics, and they need to be employed on a very independent manner. By that I mean cronyism has no place in bureaucracy. Civil servants should not be like the first-hand relative or kin of the mayor or any other upper or senior public servant. Cronyism is doesn't have a place here.
Aklına esiyor. Onlar yapılırken bir de şu
And they are spontaneous in terms of the investments, and everything is out of control. So such strategical plans, their correlation with the budget and the disclosure to the public and follow-up. That's why we have this book on the existing SDGs, how much they are integrated into this and what are the activities. We have to be aware of that, because otherwise the citizens, as you indicated, they're not aware of this. They have no idea. SDG, you know, someone in New York wrote them down and UNDP is mentioning them, and they're good stuff, okay, but what has to do, do they have to do with me? They don't know that. To what extent and in what fashion are they going to, the municipalities going to implement this? And there is a lack of contact with the public. And what is the budget allocated for that? That's what I mean by transparency. At least we should have those things in place. Social aid you mentioned, for example, according to what criteria, and who are the recipients of those according to which eligibility criteria? The statement, the activity statements or the reports are not talking about those, and the final reports have to be disclosed to the public. Plus, they have been trying to do this for so many years. Actually, the financial and the other type of information and inventory of municipalities cannot be found anywhere in an aggregated fashion. The local data, we have been saying this for so long, for such a long time. People are trying to establish their database with funding from UNDP, but not so much has been achieved. And you know, from the Minister of Environment and Domestic Affairs, how many personnel, what is the gender distribution, to what extent, you know, they have the real estate, the municipalities, depending on the size, so on and so forth. We even lack that data. Talking about transparency, even in the collection or the publication of data, we have some progress to make. For so many years, it has been at the desired level. So the transparency is in such situation, accountability could be in two phases. So both legal accountability and as well as the data. Even the Court of Cassation, they are publishing their reports about the municipalities. However, the follow-up is not there. So, you know, what is the result? What is the resolution from the High Court or from any other institution? You can't have it. For example, a 1 meter long hose is sold normally in a shop for 3 lira, and we see that, we saw in the news that one municipality paid 5 times for the same product, which is 1 meter long hose, and that required actually a due process, and the citizens do not know actually the results. And I think the public servant cases should be handled at the normal administrative levels. And we have law on number 4483, and we have another law on the judgment of the public officials. So, you know, we have a law which is protecting the public servants, the governor, so on and so forth. So they're not very easily touchable. You can't hold them accountable for corruption or illegal conduct of affairs. Even if you try to do that, it's not very easy. So the privileges, as a former bureaucrat, I say that we have to remove those privileges so that they will be judged accordingly. Only in that case they know how, to what extent they are accountable. And all of those should be done from the perspective of accountability, so that they're not only buzzwords, but everyone should know that they are going to be held accountable in one way or another. So actually, in the local administration reform initiatives, that's what we try to do. Everything what we discuss has been put into an activity, particularly transparency and accountability. We are still working on a project. What is the case in EU countries and how does it perform in Turkey, including number of municipalities. We are going to take them to Sweden. Actually, from the Swedish Union of Municipalities, Magnus was here. I'm not sure whether he or she's here now. So actually, as UNDP, these are the things which we try to make a contribution to. So my last remark is, if we do all this in terms of good governance, structural reforms, so that it won't be only buzzwords, but municipalities will be a part of that. Thank you so much. Well, thank you very much. I think you have touched upon a very important point. Corruption is a resource disappearing. And actually, while it could have been used somewhere else, and that is, abused and misused, corruption is a very important barrier preventing the development of societies. Not many people are aware of that, but people, that's the case. When there's a corruption on the level of the institutions, they lose more. In 2015, under the Turkish presidency of G20 as ARGE consultancy, we were a knowledge partner in B20. There was a professor from Harvard and mathematically proved that on the case of Siemens. Okay, Arda, now going back to you. So you are preparing a great deal of reports in the region. From that perspective, what are your findings in terms of sustainability? What are the opportunities? Well, as I told you before, I would like to repeat it, what I said at the very beginning. Actually, it's sort of very hypothetical. Believe me, it's not only for Anatolia, but SDGs, the objectives, even while pronouncing them. Anatolian people can't even easily pronounce that. They are so abstract, which means that you have to explain it over and over. And we have to internalize and understand it. We believe that. We think, we assume we understand. We are in the ivory tower. We are sitting down. We are preparing those reports. And we have to accept that we are in a learning process. We have to be self-critical in this respect. And Professor just listed. He said that effective utilization of public resources, the tender practices, seniority, and these are the things actually which are rather obvious, and classical implementation problem, which is a global problem, and maybe even more in Turkey when you check it with the global indices. Unfortunately, we are short. Starting from the macro, I will work my way down to the micro. We need a change of mentality. And how are we going to have that? Well, we're going to make sure that happens by working on it. It's not going to happen through a magical wand. And let me repeat, coordination and collaboration of institutions so that they will serve the same objectives at the end of the day. And as TÜRKONFED, this is what we try to do. Simultaneously, grassroots awareness at the very basis, and you might call it lobbying or public diplomacy. The proposals which we gather from the grassroots, from the very basis, and based on the data and evidence, we create policy recommendations we submit it to the public. So it's actually a bidirectional methodology, top to bottom, bottom to top. Distinguished panelists touched upon methodology, and that's very important. Thank you so much, because we have shortcomings in the methodology. That's what I said at the very beginning. Some people come up with a strategy in Ankara, in the capital city of Turkey, and the local has no idea, or it's not at the optimum level. So without the due collection of data, they try to do something. Likewise, when you look at the local processes, when we look at the local level, they're not necessarily informed about the central policies. There is this mentality problem, and we have to act as a bridge, as TÜRKONFED. That's our mission, but this is why we were established. The business community, and that's what I would like to touch upon as a concluding remark, the functionality of the business community. Let's not belittle that, because we have a huge untapped potential which we could mobilize here. And with 250 member association, somehow we have put them into our radar. We are following them in 26 development zones in 81 cities. We collect data from micro and we submit it to the macro. With this mentality, we can simply make a change. Awareness from the grassroots, and also at the decision-taking level in Ankara, collaborating with the stakeholders over there. Only with cooperation and collaboration we could have a change of mentality. We may list everything, this is what are listed in the international reports. And we have reports to SIA, to TÜRKONFED, the unions, the chambers, municipalities. We're doing that, that's okay. But in terms of the bottleneck, in the practice, I think that has a lot to do with the mentality. That would take time, not happening overnight. Everyone has to take and do whatever they do, and we can plant the seeds of change. If there is any time left, I would like to talk about a practice, a project for business for goals. Can I talk about that, or maybe leave it? Okay, so because we have developed a number of tools, and in the last bit I will talk about that. Thank you so much. Ertuğrul, actually we have discussed so many things, and we are discussing it. For the sustainable cities, the parties should collaborate. From the perspective of the private sector, what conditions should we have so that you will be a part of that structure? What would trigger or encourage you to be a part of that as private sector? That would be great from the ethical point of view. Well, for the private industry, of course, can't be generalized. But those who believe in sustainability, who understand it, and who would like to make a contribution to this notion. There are some companies, not all of them, because they're willing to do this. So I will take their perspective. Otherwise, when you say private industry, there's a very wide range, needless to say. So most of them, actually, on an awareness level, started to work in this way from Turkish perspective. To 2008 Young Global Compact was actually the framework, and Turkey became a signatory, and that is a milestone. But it's not only sufficient to put your signature as a country. You have to understand, internalize, and put the institutions in place. Sustainability, Association of Sustainability, the platforms where you actively contribute are actually the institutions to which we are indebted, because you are raising awareness and you are training people. But it should not be only limited with Istanbul. As Mr. Arda indicated, if TOP, the Turkish Union of Chambers and stock exchanges, it's not only the sustainable cities of Ankara, Istanbul, or the other metropolitan cities. We have 81 cities in Turkey, so we have to disseminate it all throughout Turkey. And that is also important in this respect. ethics, reputation, compliance activities within the framework of the association. Okay, we made a great progress, but the world has made an extraordinary process in terms of conducting global trade. If we have any intentions, well, hopefully we will have an increased number of companies and they will become stars in their own respective industries. But even if they can't, we might have people or companies who would like to support them in supply chain, and hence a contribution to the socio-economic development of the cities of the country. And we have to render those companies preferred ones for SMEs, for medium-scale companies. However, we're not there. We are actually way behind. We have to simply inform these parties, and on the level of we have to create awareness, raise awareness on the public and private industry level, and we have to have companies who would show them the way and guide them. We need major partnership, and we are way too late for that, because socio-economic growth, if we're going to talk about socio-economic growth, social and sustainable development, they are all prerequisites which are tied with one another. We have to act upon those. Let me put it this way. Well, we always wish there is this and that. Let's put it into flesh and bone and not make them too abstract. What would harm sustainable development? Behaviors harming sustainable development, be it a private company or public institution or real or legal entity or citizen. So if we are creating an opportunity inequality in our domain of opportunity, domain of impact, which means that in the recruitment or in the promotion or the choice of supplier in a company, if I'm not offering objective criteria and conditions for the people who are competing with one another, if I make my choices based on the aspects which are outside the equalities, and as Professor indicated, it doesn't necessarily have to be gender inequality, but many aspects. If I'm simply preventing expression freedom, if I am closed, if I have a closed mind against innovation, then all these things become problems. Or conflict of interest, which is one of the biggest things which we focus on, prevention of conflict of interests. We do that. And that is, we do that, we say that for the private industry, but that's the same case for the public industry. So, be it private or public, it doesn't matter. All of them are entities belonging to a community. My stakeholder might be, my shareholder would be working for company A or B, but that company belongs to this community. That's why, as people from as the Indians say, well, we have not inherited this world or universe or planet, not from our ancestors, but from our children, because they are the real owners of this planet. So that's the same case for the know-how and expertise and the values. That's where we have to have collaboration and partnerships. And let me finish it with an example. Well, this is one of the very typical examples. Enron used to be a giant oil company in the United States. In 1999, well, their price per stock used to be $20. Top executives worked so hard, everyone thought it was very successful, and the price soared to $90. And that company had 65 pages of ethical codes of conduct. But to what extent they internalized that, they were able to practice that. So if it's only, probably, and obviously, it was merely in the words, and then we saw there were so many corruptions which were revealed, while their price used to be $90 per stock. Then it was found out that they were actually indirect by $74 million, and then they went bankrupt. And these things are actually so important. So that's actually one of the cases we always teach. And we have huge know-how and expertise in-house, and they have to simply share it with the other parties or stakeholders, hence a great contribution, or through the organizations Arda is representing, we can simply duplicate and multiply the know-how. Ertuğrul, thank you so much. What you said is actually very valid. When you look at the commercial code of any given state, you will see that companies are public assets, not the owners actually write laws. It's actually the public, because people lose their jobs, they owe money to the suppliers, all of a sudden there is negative growth in the community. We should always keep that in mind.
Sana dönmek istiyorum.
I would now like to give the floor to you. What kind of an environment do we need so that everything is possible? Is what we've talked about. So that's a very interesting question, actually, because citizens consider themselves very ineffective and passive in a way. What can we do? We are fighting like global companies, we have large NGOs in front of us, but in the end, every decision is made on citizen level, because the employees are the citizens themselves, the taxpayer is the citizen. The United Nations is aware of that, and I am just going to read out SDG 16. SDG 16 talks about peace and strong institutions in the world, the establishment of transparent institutions on every level, and the establishment of transparent decision-making mechanisms. Against whom? The citizen. Because it's the citizen that elects the politicians, it's the citizen that pays taxes, it's the citizen that benefits from the services and pays for the services. So the citizen profile is a very strong profile. Let's not forget that. Representative, transparent decision-making mechanisms. That's also a definition of citizenship. So you need to be sensitive vis-à-vis your citizen. It's the customer for companies, it's the citizen for the states. Okay, so let's concretize this. This was more conceptual. There was the adoption of a new piece of legislation, 2015, the new municipality law, and we've seen the following. The infrastructure in corporate sense, in the legal sense, for the establishment of a good infrastructure in city is in place, at least on paper. So cities are considered the catalysts of good development, good governance. So greater municipalities and provincial municipalities take over the role of good governance. And they need to be transparent, they need to be accountable, and so on and so forth. The city council is defined in this way, and everybody else. It's in the activity report, it's in any kind of report, and they need to ensure as well the access of information, the access to information. So we as citizens, as a component of civil society, are the strongest. We are very strong. But why do we not act strong? Because there is lack of implementation, despite the pieces of legislation that are in place. So in order for us to be stronger, to act stronger, we need to be aware of our rights. When you do a little internet search, you will come across many rights of citizens, and Fikret Tokgöz is with us here today. They've conducted many studies in this regard, LAR 1, LAR 2, LAR 3, and so on and so forth. So why do we still do not act strong? We've seen that both in the public and in the private sector, and I am leaving TÜRKONFED out a little bit, there is a little blindness on behalf of the citizens. So local problems, transportation problems, resilience of buildings are only considered global or universal problems. No, they are local problems. For example, last week's earthquake put forth on the agenda the issue of the resilience and strength of buildings in this city. And citizens need to demand answers, and municipalities need to provide them. This is a right. You need to create pressure for every city, not only in Istanbul, Adana, and anywhere else. You need to ask what the municipalities have outlined in cases of emergencies, for example, in cases of natural disasters. You need to demand answers, request answers. And today, as panelists, we have representatives from the employer's side, and we need to ensure that companies lose customers, or that we do not buy from customers that do not ensure, for example, equal pay for women and men and many other issues. As customers, as consumers, we are very, very strong. You can build up pressure by telling companies, you all remember the Nike example. Nike has invested in commercials, and then the child labor issue in Taiwan was discovered, and then Nike came into a very, very difficult position. So we need to demand equal pay, non-child labor, and so on and so forth. How much value do companies attach to sustainability? And the same holds true for civil society. Civil society in Turkey, when you build an association, when you establish an association, you think that civil society only demands, is only demanding side. No, civil society also need to be transparent participants in the process. I don't see the minutes of board meetings and so on and so forth, for example, of civil society institutions on the internet. İnan, thank you very much. The awareness vis-a-vis civil society institutions and civil society is very important, and we've done a study on that. It's on the internet, you can Google it. It comprises China, India, South Africa, England, the States, Turkey, and Germany, and including 180 companies coming from these countries. We've looked at how much they disclose on the internet pertaining to their minutes of board meetings, for example, or activity reports, and so on and so forth. What I can say is that there is still a lot that is missing when it comes to sustainability targets, for example. Most of the company's activities are not aligned with sustainability principles or other principles that we value. We want to create an environment of learning and exchange of knowledge. I would highly urge you to take a look at that on the internet. So we are coming towards the end of this session. Just a final closing remarks, Mr. Ferhat. What can we do that will improve the situation? Well, let me begin by saying the following. Local administrations need to play a role in good governance. When we are talking about the sustainability of cities, of course, local administrations need to play a role. But as my fellow panelists were pointing out, whatever we do, whatever local administrations do, no awareness is created in the public. And from an anthropological and socio-political standpoint, societies such as ours are governed from a central administration, and the central administration leads to the fact that everything is expected from the central government and not from local administrations such as municipalities and so on and so forth. So local administrations should adopt a role of communicating directly with the public instead of the central government or administration. So there needs to be a shift in awareness and also in expectations. I do not want to sound too pessimistic here, but in our country, this may take up a long, long time. Something needs to happen. I don't want to paint a very disastrous picture here. You've mentioned Coca-Cola's example. Mass movements happen in our country where the villagers and the farmers come in a disadvantaged position. So it's usually the farmers and the agricultural sector that raises their voice, if at all. For example, the case of Kaz Dağları, Mount Ida, just recently. Otherwise, not many people raise their voice against issues. My career is full of crisis management, but I also have adopted an educational stance. If the banking system was not reformed back in the day, then governments that came after that reform could not have amassed such or accumulated such a wealth. So everything comes with a price. And secondly, we need to strengthen the culture of consensus in local governments, in local administrations. Scandinavia has a long history of consensus. Denmark is known as a country that does not have corruption in that sense as we know it. And I've talked to an expert from Denmark back then. You know why that is, he asked me. Back in the 16th century, we used to have a king that used to behead and decapitate all the governors and all the public administrators that were involved in corruption. So we have such a history, a dark history of decapitation, and this is why we are so afraid from getting involved in corruptive practices, and this is why we have the time to engage in sustainability and other similar issues, is what he had replied to me. So this is, of course, an intellectual effort as well, but intellectual efforts, they need to find their, they need to reflect themselves in society, on the citizens. Of course, NGOs, they contribute in a very valuable fashion to this issue, but what is a civil society? I do not have a lot of trust anymore in civil society, I have to say. I've seen a lot of NGOs do copy-paste project management, nothing original, nothing unique anymore. So I've been involved quite a bit in NGO work. So if we are talking about good governance, then NGOs should really take a good critical look at themselves and reform themselves and restructure themselves. They play an important role, but nevertheless they need to take a look at themselves as well.
Yönetişim olayı da
Well, particularly in the corporate governance, you know, the biggest corruption in 1600s were seen in Netherlands, East Indian Company, to simply protect the investors. That's not a very easy process. So, from your own perspective, within the scope of the sustainable cities, what we could do, what you could do. Well, first of all, I do agree with you, and we try to simply, or we have to see the crisis as opportunities, because after all, we live in a country of crisis, and we know how to turn those into opportunities, like natural selection, actually. So from our own perspective, we try to do our best. And this is the question which we asked ourselves. And I would like to remind what I said at the beginning. As a business community organization, we asked ourselves what we should do in terms of sustainability. There are a number of activities. Someone in New York, as Professor said, these are the SDGs, so on and so forth. And we have to localize them. That's what we first noticed. And how are we going to do that? And we came up with actually a practice. And self-criticism is so important. This is what we did. So as an Anatolian business community institution, this is of course, and by nature, we try to look at everything as an SME, from an SME perspective. But when we're talking about SDGs, we need to have a more comprehensive approach. We sat down with UN and then our member TÜSİAD, and TÜSİAD is representing major companies. TÜRKONFED is representing SMEs, and UNDP, you know, has written down the Bible, the holy book of it. It's a designer, international mind. So that's the consortium which we felt was necessary. And after a certain work and a one-year diplomacy, we did something very important. And we established a business platform, and the objective 17 is about the cooperation, as İnan indicated. 16, without 16 and 17, they are very important in terms of the approach, and I agree with you. We first wanted to look at the procedure, and we actually brought together those three institutions, and maybe semi-autonomous executive board was established, and this platform, both you know, from the perspective of Anatolia, the global perspective of UN nations, and TÜSİAD, how to localize the SDGs in Turkey. This is that platform started to work on. We have a number of actually. Actually, we are beyond our time. I'm so sorry, you don't have time. Okay, natural disasters. You said natural disasters. And this is what we saw. We have AFAD. And after the earthquake or after the disaster happens, they have the capability of mobilization in terms of the intervention. But in case a natural disaster strikes Marmara, this water, how it is going to be distributed? We don't have an urgent action plan. And just like that, we are talking about the localization, complex emergency and natural disasters, which is also including the subject of refugees. Well, what kind of things we could have in Turkey? That's what we started to work on. Another example within the scope of this initiative is capacity development, digital literacy, financial literacy of SMEs. I know you're staring at me. I know our time is up. That's okay. And the Anatolia business community, Fortune 500, and United Nations, also the public the public stakeholders are going to be gathered together, and the good practices of SDGs in Turkey will be implemented. Thank you so much. Arda, thank you so much. Now going back to Ertuğrul. You mentioned Coca-Cola, and because you worked there. So About sustainable city, did you have any collaboration for a partnership? If yes, can you please share that example with us? Well, thank you so much. Until now, I've always talked about the association, not the company. But I do agree with you. First of all, as civil society, we have to be transparent and accountable so that we will have trust, and that would be continued. Now I'm taking that hat off, and I will continue with my representative of my company, that hat. So everyone has to become a learning organization, self-awareness, self-consciousness. As Arda Bey, we have to be self-critical. And in my company is a Turkish company. I know that would sound rather different when you hear Coca-Cola. Naturally, you are thinking of a global company. I work for Coca-Cola Beverages, and it is active in 10 different countries with Coca-Cola franchise operations, factories, and it is listed at Istanbul Stock Exchange. It's a Turkish asset, that company. And you simply gave the Indian company as an example. Did the system learn from them? Well, we have activities in Pakistan. That's what we did. Pakistan, I think the water access in SDGs, it's number 14 if I'm not mistaken. He's not audible. Okay, hygiene, you say, the sixth one. Almost 40% of the Pakistani population have difficulties in terms of accessing water, potable water and clean water. Well, just like we described within the principles of the sustainable reporting, whichever country we are positioned in, we identify the socio-economic situation, we identify that degree of the degree of importance, and we saw that we could not do it. We prioritized that worldwide Pakistan, and coupled with a number of other local institutions, including the municipalities, we designated a project called PANI. And with that project, our factories, small-scale reverse osmosis and ultrafiltration systems have been put into the water supply systems. Until now, 24 units, which are called factories, were established. 2,000 liters per hour fresh water is produced, and that is covering the hygienic clean water need of 20,000 people, and until now 750,000 people benefited from that practice. And the biggest problem created by is that waterborne diseases, typhoid, dysentery, cholera, and some other diseases.
Ve buna ekstra bir çözümün parçası olma konusunda bir şirketin yapabileceği iyi bir uygulama. Ama bununla da yetmedi. Sistem olarak insan hakları politikası yayınladı. Bu insan hakları politikasının 11. maddesi, çok kısa bir şekilde şöyle okuyacağım size. Arazi hakları ve su kaynakları. Tıpkı konuştuğunuz, değindiğiniz konular. Diyor ki özetle, değer zincirimiz kapsamındaki arazi ve su kullanımımızın insan haklarına olası etkilerinin farkındayız. Ve bu konuyu özel politika ve uygulamalarla ele alırız. Çevre politikamıza paralel olarak insanın su kaynaklarına ve güvenli içme suyuna olan ihtiyacına ve uygun sanitasyon ile hem ekosistemlerin hem de toplumların korunmasına saygı duyarız diyor ve bu konuda da projeler geliştirerek çalışmaya başladı.
Çok teşekkür ederiz. Aslında bu çok önemli. Bir bilinç oluşmuş ve bunu yaygınlaştırmaya çalışıyor. Bu sonuçta başkalarını da etkileyecek bir davranış. Ayrıca sürdürülebilir kalkınma hedefi 6'ya yönelik bir çözüm üretmişler ama sonuçta sürdürülebilir kalkınma 3'ü de tetiklemişler bir taraftan. Böyle bir etkileşimin de olduğunu görebiliyoruz. İnan çok kısa.
And İnan, This is a sustainable city, is a development initiative. You know, there is a good life index by OECD. So from that perspective, through which kind of a coalition we could do this to increase life quality, but very fast, because we are actually completely beyond our time. Okay, so I will finish it very quickly. So actually, this is where we have the gridlock. So at a certain point, a local sustainable development coalition is what we need. So in line with the regulation, but going beyond that, because all of the stakeholders have that need, and there's a need for a coalition logic. That's what we have to simply put into a tangible format. So in the construction of sustainability in the cities, it's not only up to the public, so to say. We should acknowledge this at the very beginning. The economic fields are the main drivers. 257 billion in GDP. And Istanbul constitutes 1/3 of the overall Turkish economy with that GDP, which means that companies creating that has a certain commitment, responsibility, NGOs, municipalities, and public institutions. How should they complement one another? In which fields shall we have cooperation? The best example should be started from the local. You are a district municipality and you have a social policy. You say you would like to increase employment. You have a business protocol with the business community. You have invited NGOs. You have opened up space for cooperation. And as a public entity, database, human resources, and office, I will provide those. And you tell us what you need. Let's have cooperation and let's organize vocational education. This is micro. At the macro level, there is a biological pollution and contamination of Marmara Sea. A green economy field is being born as we speak. The investors who would like to invest in this field simply shall be brought together, including and mobilizing the public sources. How to clean up Marmara, that's what we have to discuss. Or, you know, in the disaster in Istanbul, I think people are going to simply be more serious. And there's going to be another urban regeneration, maybe moving towards the north, might be simply might be kicked off. We have to learn from our past and we have to shape the future accordingly. Investors, public, private, NGOs, we need to have a common denominator. This is where good governance comes into play. The stakeholders, are they accountable? Are they transparent? Do they take inclusive approaches in terms of decision making? Only when we establish those principles, we can start talking and working and establishing these coalitions for the sustainable cities. İnan, thank you so much. Very briefly, SDGs are actually targets, but on the other hand, they indicate problems which the world has to tackle, creating opportunities for business communities, and if they simply create solutions, they also trigger solutions. Unfortunately, we don't have time, so we can't have Q&A. But in case you have questions, we can take them outside. Thank you very much.